As we move through what feels like chaotic times in our world, we often feel like things are chaotic inside ourselves as well. This might beg the question, what tools might we want to have on board to help us navigate times of high stress, uncertainty, and change? How can we learn to self-soothe, find clarity, and move beyond feelings of frustration through times like this? I think this conversation you're about to watch will help explore these concepts on a deeper level. In it, I speak to Irene Lyon, who has 20 years experience as a nervous system specialist and somatic neuroplasticity expert. By the end of this conversation, you'll have a better understanding of how to navigate fast-paced and rapidly changing times with capacity and resilience. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Alrighty, welcome. How are you doing today so far, Irene?
How am I doing today? I'm okay. I'm really liking the fact that the days are getting longer.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was the first winter where I actually felt like, okay, I want this to be over. So I'm usually pretty good with the dark and cold, but I cannot wait for it to be like May
Yeah. Yeah, I feel you.
here.
My
Yeah.
my wife's from Arizona. She wants all winters to never happen.
I like the rain. I like the seasons, but the more I learn about the importance of getting sun on our skin
Mm,
and like sun when the sun is high and in our eyes, and the more I'm like, okay, I think now I know why people, what is it called? They're called snowbirds, where they like go
right.
south for the
Yeah.
winter.
Yeah.
So I get it. Like if I could go to Arizona right now, I would.
Yeah. Well, speaking
Yeah.
of that, I mean,
Yeah.
crazy times right now. Obviously, the world is in a very sort of chaotic state, if you will. I mean, there's obviously good things that are happening as well, but there's a
Hmm.
lot of stuff. People are feeling a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of different emotions coming up and going on, and we don't really know what tomorrow's going to bring. That's what it feels like. In your world of nervous system health, neuroplasticity, what does that mean? What is that? How do people know if their nervous systems are being affected by what's going on in our immediate environment right now?
There's many signs. And I think one of the more macro pieces that I'm going to start with, just to make it even more complex,
Hmm.
is that, yes, things are really unpredictable right now and uncertain and things are changing, but that was always kind of there in different ways before.
Hmm.
If you want to, I don't know, it's like there's this pre and post, I don't know what we're going to call it, but, um, and so the interesting thing is that one way that we know our nervous system is off, I mean, there's like a laundry list. So
Yeah.
our sleep is off, our digestion is off, our immune system is off, our cardiovascular system, how our heart is working, blood pressure, our cognitive ability,
Hmm.
right? Our memory, our ability to think and, read a page and actually have read it, as opposed to, whoa, I don't know what I just read. I'm sure everyone's done that before. I know I have.
Yeah.
Also, another sign that our nervous system is off is our social connections. So, are we craving people, or are we wanting to kind of sequester away, hibernate, and like push everyone away?
Hmm.
Um, the interesting thing, if I use that example, is a lot of people might be like, well, I was like that. I've always been like that. And the key with that is, okay, well, if that's the case, then there might be something going on in the nervous system, because us humans, mammals, we're meant to be social. And because we're not completely, we're mammals, right, as human animals, but we're also human. And so we have this creativity in us, this ability to be introspective. I don't like the word introvert, but some people might call it that. Like we can hunker away and like write a book for a year
Yeah.
or paint or get into a project and everything just drops away. I think that's really important too. But if that's all we're doing and being around folks creates anxiety, we would call this social anxiety, that's not good either.
Yeah.
um, but to go back to your question, like how do we know if our nervous system is being affected? It's really our health and all the pieces that go with it, because our health is dictated by the autonomic nervous system. So when we talk about nervous system, that's what we mean, and how it governs all these internal systems that I just kind of named off. Hormones, that's another one, hormonal imbalance. um, so I'll end there and then see if that
Yeah.
leads you to another question.
Well, so one of the things when I first started doing a lot of like my journey into like bettering myself, 13, 14 years ago, health was a big
Hmm.
one. And
Yeah.
what I've learned more recently through a lot of the work that you do and that I've been kind of learning a lot about is that if you are having health issues, it is very reasonable in the holistic way of looking at it to also look at your nervous system, right? And say like for me, I had gut issues where
Yeah.
my digestion would be off, and
Yeah.
but nowhere when you look around are they telling you like, oh no, it's because you don't have probiotics, or maybe you're eating this food that's problematic, or maybe it's gluten, or maybe it's this.
Mm.
But I've actually gained significantly more progress in my gut through nervous system work than anything else. Can you touch a little bit on like why that's important for gut health and perhaps just all health in general?
100%. So the first thing I'll say is nutrition is important.
Yeah.
That's I studied that in my 20s pretty intensively. So, a person wants to look at that, but what I've seen, and it sounds like you're in this situation too, many of my clients and students were like saints with their food
Yeah.
and all of that stuff, and then they still had constipation, irritable bowel, chronic diarrhea, whatever you want, bloating,
Yeah.
gas, basically the signs that things are not flowing in the direction they should be flowing,
Yeah.
right? And I use, if someone's watching, they'll see that I'm doing this with my hand. It's like this floating, sine wave thing. That's flow in the whole body, and we need it. And so the interesting thing with the gut is that it has so many nerve endings, so many nerves going to it. One of the big ones is the vagus nerve, which is a very popular nerve and everyone's talking about it, but many people don't get into the distinctions. So I'm going to just cover a few of the distinctions if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, like, we have this autonomic nervous system that is part of our peripheral nervous system, and peripheral just means coming out from the center, right? The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And so that peripheral nervous system has this autonomic nervous system. And that autonomic nervous system has I'm being very simple here, has two other branches. One is the sympathetic and one is the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is that fight flight, right? Someone shouts at me, a big scary thing happens, I'm going to startle, I might flee, someone's maybe attacking me, I might fight them, all the anger, that's the fight flee, that's the sympathetic. The parasympathetic, people often dub it rest digest, and that's partially true.
Mm-hmm.
And you know this because you've studied this a bit more with me. But think of the parasympathetic not as rest digest, but as slowing down. And what that slowing down is, it depends on the level of threat, stress, or true relaxation that's happening. So there's two branches to the parasympathetic. One is what we would call the high tone
Mm-hmm.
dorsal of the parasympathetic, the vagus. The other is the low tone of the parasympathetic, which is the vagus nerve. So those are all the distinctions. High tone is what happens when someone goes into shock. It is a slowing down that is abrupt. It's what happens when someone faints. And it's also what happens if someone's being attacked, for example, and they can't comprehend what's happening, so they completely shut down. This is what happens when someone, when they soil themselves, when they pee their pants, the system just, we gotta unload because there's danger. So there's this high tone dorsal of the parasympathetic that's survival, it's shut down, it's the freeze response. I'm kind of blending them all in. The low tone dorsal, that is the real rest digest.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to be living in as mammals most of the time.
Yeah.
So even though I'm here with you and I have a little more rev in my body, have a little coffee, I'm sitting upright, we're talking, so I have to keep my higher brain on. I want to have a little bit of that low tone dorsal because I'm not in fight. We're not fighting with each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not arguing or anything like that. When we're chilling out at night, watching a show, having some dinner, having a glass of wine, having a cup of tea, in the bath, reading a book, sleeping, We want to be in that low tone dorsal, the
Yeah.
true rest digest. And then this is where it comes into the gut. When we're in that real rest digest, the lining of the gut, it stitches back up. There's this barrier in the gut, and it needs to be repaired every day because of the wear and tear of just digestion.
Yep.
If we don't get that, if we don't go into that low tone dorsal when we're chilling and sleeping, the repair doesn't occur. This is where leaky gut comes in. This is where inflammation goes in. Anyone knows if they have a bad night's sleep, and they might not even know that their gut is not getting repaired, but they just, you feel more inflamed. You don't feel like you've restored yourself at night. That means that you're not going into that low tone dorsal sleep. Now, the interesting thing is that some people will be like, well, I sleep, so doesn't that mean that I'm resting and digesting? And the answer is not necessarily. You might be sleeping, but you're sleeping in a high tone dorsal state.
Yeah.
Your sleep is more from a sense of shutdown, and like, it's the classic person that lays down and they're out.
Yeah.
And if you try to wake them, like, you might not be able to, or it takes a lot to get them up. One could say that someone who sleeps like that is kind of sleeping in a high tone, freeze, shut down state. And when you're in that high tone dorsal state, the system is still in survival. So even though it's a shutdown, under it, the sympathetic is running the show as well.
Yeah.
So over time, this is why someone might have a stressful event happen and their digestion kind of goes off for a little bit. And then there's some folks who have been like that since birth because of birth trauma, maybe in utero stress, and they never get out of that high tone dorsal and that high sympathetic fight flight. And then this, Joe, and everyone watching, is where you get folks with these chronic bowel problems or chronic autoimmunity. Sadly, we're seeing, I think, it seems to me, I don't have any research to quote, but more and more young people are getting these chronic illnesses.
Yeah.
And I think that's a factor of many kinds. I think it's our food supply. I think it's the chemicals, the toxins, but I also know it's the pace of our lives is just so much more intense. And humanity is sort of like accumulating all this stress. And of course, the kiddos are the ones that they're like the canaries in the coal mine in some ways, right?
Yeah.
So that's how the digestion piece comes in. But we could then have the exact same conversation for the immune system, for the circulation, for the hormonal system, all of it. So we really need to have a good balance between those peripheral nervous system centers. We need to have fight, flight, and freeze for survival, but we don't want to be living in it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And you know, it's interesting too. I mean, I was going to share an anecdote. I don't know if it's worth it to go back to it because we've expanded, but what the anecdote was essentially that I had a moment in my childhood. When you were describing where that high tone door, like my body just went into pure freeze and I wet myself, but some guy had pulled out a weapon right in front of me and I didn't know if he was going to attack me. And I was only maybe 12, at the time. And it was very dark and I was like standing there, like, and there was two of them and they were like giant. Right. And like, he was like, staring me down and I'm like cornered. Right. And what was fascinating about it was my body went into, I was in the back seat. My body took over and just did, you're frozen, you're shut down. And even when I tried to stop peeing, I couldn't. It just took over. So there's something fascinating about that particular situation. But now that that's all on the table, everybody knows that happened to Joe.
Well, I'm glad you were okay. That's intense.
Yeah, no.
For 12, holy cow.
Yeah, and so one of the details, and you're talking about how, health plays in, and there's all these different factors. I think one of the takeaways that's important just to touch on here is just the idea that it's like we have so much going on and we always want to identify the one thing that it is, right? But really there's so many things that play into it. And what I found is, in my experience so far in this health journey of this many 13 years or 14 years, 15 years, I don't remember when it started, but how foundational this stuff is, right?
Yeah.
And this is kind of where it goes into like, if people are wondering like, who is this type of, nervous system work for? Maybe you can elaborate on who could benefit from this.
Everyone. And I know that's kind of a cop-out answer, and I'll go into it, but I mean, what's happening right now is actually, I'm going to give an anecdote. So you inspired me. If I think about places that I've been to, like my mother is from the Philippines, so I'm half Filipino. When you go into the barrio there, like the village life, and where she grew up, there's still, water buffalo and rice paddies in the backyard. Like it's it is full on, except for, the Coca-Cola and the blue jeans and the cars. It's still the way it was in some ways. And, when we were there last, there were 10 people sleeping in a room that we just have a king size bed in and, a closet, and they're all sleeping on the floor.
Yeah.
The baby, the older people, and then of course we're thrown into the living room on a couch, and that's fine. I'm like, how are they all fitting in that room? Even the girlfriend, of my mom's nephew is in there, and they're all sleeping in this one room. And I'm like, this is really crazy. But in those cultures, when babies are born, they have always connection. They're never alone in a crib, ever. There are no cribs, at least at that level of socioeconomic status. If you were to go in Manila, totally different. But the kids, the humans, are being brought into the world with this connection. They're always being held. They're comfortable with everyone. And when you hold a baby there, they're so relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God. It's like picking up a cat,
Yeah.
like cats that aren't, of course, abused or anything. They're just fun. They're just like, or dogs, they're just so chill. And so the reason I'm saying that is how we were raised, and that connection and that attunement teaches us how our nervous system works. So in that situation in the barrio, with babies being held by everyone and being connected and sung to and moved, and they're very self-regulated at like age 3.
Yeah.
They know how to, you would never see a kid cry there. I remember the first time I went there with my first husband, he noticed it. At one point, he said to my mom, I have not seen any children cry since I've been here. Seriously.
Yeah.
And my mom just sat there. Yep. And it's true. Like, unless they're hurt or they fall, they don't cry. They don't fuss. That little one is super regulated.
Yeah.
Super connected to their body, because they're being connected to and co-regulated with their not just their mother, but the entire family system. So the reason I went off on that little bit of a tangent is, for everyone living in more, let's call it, I don't know what the politically correct term is, but Western culture, British culture, Commonwealth culture, very, proper, where kids were left in rooms by themselves to try to go to sleep, and that kind of culture. We all need this work. And that's why I kind of said everyone, but it depends on your upbringing. Because you go to these places like the Philippines, when there are natural disasters, and they happen, and things are very authoritarian there, people are still really fine. I mean, sure, they're stressed from time to time, but if you had that early upbringing, you can be super resilient in the worst of situations.
Yeah.
So if we think of those of us, and most people listening to this will know, I didn't really have that. I was put in a crib. I was left to cry myself to sleep, I think.
Yeah.
I wasn't allowed to sing and dance and play and be a goofy 4-year-old the way 4-year-olds should be, or 3-year-olds. I wasn't taught how to do chores. I wasn't taught regulation. Mom and dad hated each other, but they stayed together for the kids because that's what you did. And so I had to watch their tension, all these things, right? So I say everyone because we know through the research, Joe, that if we do not heal our nervous system and we stay living in this chronic state of fight, flight, and freeze, that is what creates the chronic illness, many of the nervous system related disorders, many cancers, heart disease, autoimmunity, addiction. I mean, the list is super long. And so because of this research, it's the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. I hate to say factual, but it's been shown over and over again in multiple countries in meta-analyses. This is what creates the illness that we see in humans.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind, of course, poison from the environment and all those things. But generally speaking, our nervous system governs our health.
Yeah.
And so if we know that we're carrying old traumas, if we know that we don't have the repertoire of human emotion to be sad, joyful, surprised, feel anger, see things that are difficult and not, freeze or shut down, if we don't have the whole repertoire of human emotion and being able to connect to our internal environment, sort of what's called our introsception, sooner or later, something will get us. I know that sounds really doomsday. But, how many people do you know, elderly, who die of just old age?
Not many.
Like to the point where grandma or grandpa is before, like they go to bed one night and they just don't wake up. They're still shoveling snow. They're still planting the garden. They're still walking. They're still cooking. They're still 100% mentally there. They're not on any medications. And it's very rare.
And this is where it's interesting of what we've come to accept as normal. And, that's not just a societal thing, but this is also on a personal level. Like we may think that like, oh no, like I'm well regulated. I'm normal. I get up, I go to work, I raise a family, I do this, I do that. But sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And I've said that to myself so many times over the last, 14, 15 years is like, I didn't know I could feel better. Oh, I didn't know I could feel better. And you keep realizing that our capacity to feel better increases. And you're like, once it happens enough times, you start to go, okay, you know what? I'm just not going to accept a limitation per se. I'm going to be open to continual expansion. And I kind of wanted to sort of shift gears a little bit and go into kind of like my experience with your work. For those that have been sort of following Collective Evolution and the Pulse for a long time, they know that we went through a very difficult time probably like 3-4 years ago where there was a huge big tech shutdown. Right. And so, for me, it was losing a lot of our predictable revenue, having to let go of, the team and having to do all these, so many different pieces of basically economic instability and all the stress that came along with it and not knowing what was going to happen next, not knowing what to do as a business. We had to pivot. It was like, a very, very difficult time. On top of that, that was coupled with I had purchased a retreat center and there was a bad business relationship, and that business relationship was also very stressful. And these two events at one time sent me into a tailspin that, regardless of my, breath work and meditation and good diet and good this, I was missing a foundational piece that was just so crucial. And I learned that through doing your 21-day nervous system tune-up, which for me, it's like, I kind of describe it because I've kind of recommended it to a number of people. And I'm like, it's kind of like having an operating manual for your own biology and physiology so you can navigate, human life. And I've seen how important it is for me to have this knowledge, this manual, if you will, on board and all the various little exercises that go into it. But, I mean, I'd be curious to you. I mean, do you view this as like, I guess, discuss from your experience, the empowerment that comes from having this knowledge? Like, how does that show up in reality from what you've seen with your clients?
The fact that you just used the word empowerment is really cool because we don't do a lot of statistical analysis from our students, but we'll do a survey at the end of our larger course, Smart Body, Smart Mind, which is another program, which I know you've done a bit of. And the word that is used over and over again at the end is, I am more empowered. I now know what empowerment feels like. and it's funny because it never was a word that I would have considered. I would have thought healthier, less anxious. I can sleep better. But there's something about them choosing that word that really shows the macro quality of this work.
Mm-hmm.
And, what you were just saying about that stressful time few years ago, that's survival based, right?
Yeah.
So despite the kind of work and what happened in our current world, if we don't have an income source and we're not sure where our next paycheck is going, there's a problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? At least in the current way that we live. And then you mentioned the social, I forget what it was, but there was something, oh yeah, the business retreat
Yeah.
center.
Yeah.
And so my sense is there was a partner and things went sour.
It was a great learning lesson.
That stuff hurts because,
Yeah.
I've experienced that. I've lost colleagues and friends, not due to death, but due to personal conflict. And it hurts when
Yeah.
you know that you haven't done anything wrong. Right?
And the interesting part of it is in that situation, I was learning how to say no,
Exactly.
which is a fascinating aspect of my past too.
Yes. And that's a big part of, believe it or not, nervous system health is boundaries. If, again, it comes back to that baby, when that little one has not been taught right from wrong, if they haven't felt what it's like for a parent, and I'm going to speak a bit more loudly in a second, but like to say, no, don't touch that.
Yeah.
No, that's not right, which is missing in so much of the nurturing that I see with new kids. Is there's this fear that if we're more forceful, it's abuse. But there's a difference between that kind of that would be healthy shame, where you're connected with the kid, versus you're a piece of whatever, like you're so stupid. How could you do that? Right.
Yeah.
That's how some kids are taught. And then there's this other situation where it's just like, no, honey, don't touch that. You might burn yourself.
Yeah.
And so the little one, they don't internalize the strong boundary. So we learn boundaries first from how our caregivers teach us a boundary around how we might hurt ourselves if we touch the candle or whatever, or pull on the dog's tail.
Yeah.
Right. But if we come back to what you were saying, I think I might have forgot if there was a question there.
Well, it was just kind of like you were touching on the empowerment piece
right. So what happens, I find, and it's complex, but because we have a higher brain, Joe, and we're not just animals in the wild hanging and doing our thing, eating, sleeping, procreating, keeping our young safe. We have more complexity and chaos, if you will, and mastery that comes with that. And when you said it's like an operating manual, if we don't understand that the tightness in our chest, for example, which some might term anxiety, or the butterflies in the stomach, is a sign of maybe I shouldn't go down this path, literally or metaphorically, or the tightness in the throat is holding back tears.
Yeah.
That's a very common one. We are tracking and knowing that these sensations are a clue to something going on physiologically. We'll just jump over them. Or, as you mentioned, okay, I feel tightness in my chest. I better do some breathing to get rid of it. Now, if someone has no other tools, then do the breathing.
Yeah.
Because we don't want that person having a heart attack or going into more panic and fainting or whatever.
Yeah.
My classic example is if you're feeling anger, a lot of it, and you want to get that anger out, and your only solution is breathing so that you don't hit your kid, then breathe. But what often happens is, because we're not given this operating manual and we're not taught from that young age, this sensation is something saying something isn't right.
Yeah.
Feel it rather than try to get rid of it. If we don't know that, we will do the coping strategy, the management strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where addiction comes in, right? The self-soothing techniques that aren't techniques, but are substances. So again, I'm not going to say to someone, don't have that drink if that means you're going to be kind to your kids tonight. Have the drink. I mean, I'm not promoting that, but if there isn't another option, it's important to know what you need so that you don't act out and cause more harm.
Yeah.
But from what I've seen, and you know, you've done so much work before you got into this work, the students that I come across, they're dedicated to their healing and learning.
Yeah.
And many people will say, how come no one taught me this before?
Yeah.
How come you're the only one? And it's not true. I'm not the only one, but it's new. This work is very new. If we think about one of my main key teachers, Peter Levine, who founded somatic experiencing, he only really came across this work in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And then it took 20 years for it to become a methodology. And that work is still evolving.
Yeah.
If we think of it in the terms of medicine, if medicine, I don't know how you would term that, only was developed and said, this is medicine in the 60s, we would still be in the Stone Ages with what a doctor does, you know? And so, anyway, there's so much richness when we have the capacity to know what's going on in our physiology in a way that is empowering, but also gives us information about what we need.
Yeah.
And when we didn't get that growing up, and when our parents didn't get it, and their parents, which is usually the case, we have an issue.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why, I mean, it's so common. I was in the fitness and nutrition industry before I got into neuroplasticity and healing and trauma. No one came to the gym wanting an exercise program because they were still kind of healthy.
Yeah.
It never happened. They came because they had an injury, maybe troubles with their blood pressure. Usually it was because they were overweight. They knew they had to drop some pounds. But very, very rarely would someone come in proactively.
Yeah.
And so if we think about the disorders and the conditions related to the nervous system, we're still embryonic as a whole, as a humanity, and realizing, oh yeah, that IBS, oh yeah, that autoimmune, oh yeah, that kind of cancer, oh yeah, that anxiety that's actually sympathetic activation, that can be worked with. It doesn't need a benzodiazepine.
Yeah.
It doesn't need a beta blocker. And I'm not saying that some modern medicine isn't wonderful, but so many of these situations that we medicate can be worked with if a person just understood how their physiology worked. And then, of course, do the things to learn how to practice bringing more regulation, more capacity building, more connection to the environment, all those sorts of things.
Yeah. And one thing that I've been kind of really moved by with this kind of work and learning this over the last couple of years is really how much it ties in. Like for those that are watching that are really into our current events work or that are really into us building a new future and you know, the incredible world we know is really possible deep down, that can come from, you know, when the more capacity we have as people to not only see the true and identify the true challenges we have in society and have the resilience and the capacity to move through difficult times. Like it's this state of body, it's this state of being that's going to allow us to address a lot of this stuff. And so I've often kind of said, like, we will see as much change in our world as we collectively have the capacity to actually deal with it. So for those of us that are sitting back, in a sense, waiting, okay, when are we going to kind of live in that incredible world?
Yeah.
You know, this is sometimes a great place to start because we're building our collective ability to be able to handle that change.
That's spot on. And, you know, I'm glad you used the word collective because we are a collective. And then some people will say we're not. And it's kind of interesting because it's more philosophical, but like we need to take care of ourselves. And if we have dependents, like small children, right?
Yeah.
And so when we can really work on our own personal well-being at this deep level. And I'm not saying it's not about being ignorant to what's occurring out there.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot to do in here.
Yeah.
And in the general day to day. And what I've seen, if we, make this kind of time sensitive to the last couple of years, many people have just completely fallen off the trajectory of their personal health because they've been so enmeshed, so glued, literally to the television or glued to the energetic that really they can't control.
Yeah.
And that's the part that I think there's like almost, you could say, a moral issue. It's like, well, you should care about all these things. It's like, well, it's like, I live in a neighborhood, I can guarantee you somewhere within the square rate that, the 5 kilometer radius that I'm in, there is a child being beaten by their parent.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that sucks, but it's just a reality.
Yeah.
And it's sad and it sucks, but I'm not thinking about it every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the other thing, is there's having healthy acceptance and knowledge of what's going on externally. Is it outside of my door? Someone the other day was asking, I think they were in Ukraine, and like, how can we do this work when there's bombs going off outside? Like, well, in those moments, it's less about doing the trauma work. It's more being within the survival responses that you have to be in, because you have to be, and finding little ways to contain and resource and be with the immediate people around you.
Yeah.
And I know that because, again, my mom grew up during World War II, martial law, bombs were dropping, soldiers were walking down the street, and they had nothing.
Yeah.
But she still talks about it with joy because she remembers the things that were good, the playing with her brothers and sisters, rolling cigarettes for the American Army, like making French fries and selling them, finding a way to still be a part of what was going on. It's kind of weird when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
But again, because they had that early nurturing, they just had this resilience.
Yeah.
So we, Joe, like living in a more westernized, more stiff British upper lip kind of world, because our dysregulation was already probably pretty big to begin with, and our disconnection from self was already probably big to begin with, and our capacity was low, it is that much easier to get sucked into the drama. Yeah. Right? The trauma. Yeah. And so, this importance of what can a person do individually, to go back to that collective thing, because the more each individual works at this, it feeds the collective. Yeah. And as crazy as this sounds, like if we were to teach all young people, and by young, I mean, in their 20s, this work, and really teach them, this is how we need to raise humans. Yeah. Because there is a right way. And I know there's debate about this kind of parenting, that kind of, it's like, well, no, in the wild, there's no parenting books. They just know how to nurture their young, lick them, keep them safe, feed them. They'll never leave them alone somewhere unless something's really wrong. Like, there is a right way to raise a mammal. We know that. Mm-hmm. But if we were to do that mass scale, it wouldn't take very long for our entire collective humanity to change. Yeah. But that's kind of like, some might say, a pipe dream, because how will that happen? Right. But I'm like, anything's possible. And if you're not going to start with you, then who will do it, right? And that's kind of the... You have to. Yeah. That's kind of the big thing. And how are we for time? Because I know I have 2 more things, but I know we might be tight. Good. We're good. Okay. So, coming off that, we look at the past, if we're staying time sensitive for a second, we look at the past bit. And one of the things that comes up a lot is, we've lost our ability to communicate and talk with each other, and we don't want to, we can't agree on anything, and we're at odds with each other. And it's because of, the fake news, or it's because of this. But really, I mean, when we look at the vagus nerve and our social engagement system, and we look at dysregulation and how that's going to affect our ability to socially engage on good faith with one another,
this becomes another important detail where even if we are trying to move through crisis type solutions and we've done the work to have meaningful social engagement with each other, we're going to figure things out together better. Can you touch on, how even social engagement plays in to this work?
Yeah, I mean, this is very time sensitive, but it also isn't in some ways, because one of the things I've learned and seen from, if I just think of even close colleagues and friends who kind of do this work, but they're newer at this work. I mean, I've been doing this, I'm not good at math, but I started healing and health world in 96.
Mm-hmm.
And the trauma stuff really in kind of starting in 2007. And one of the things that comes online, Joe, when we are more regulated and connected to our biology, is we know what's good for us and what isn't good for us.
Mm-hmm.
To go back to that boundary thing, right? We are less likely to stay in a toxic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
We won't stand for it. We might see it because we don't want to, completely disengage from, say, a sibling or a parent or whatever, because we just don't want to be that person. But we won't let their views, their values, their lack of care for their own system impact us or me or them. And so it's interesting because there's this thought that we need to be all one and come together. It goes back to that collective thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still not sure. Like, I kind of ponder this. I still am not sure if that will happen, or if there really will become a very strong divide.
Mm.
But with goodness, those people are there and they're good together, and those people are there and they're good together, and they're peaceful because they're in their camp. There's no way that in the animal species you would have all the animal kingdom hanging out together. I mean, they are. But the pack of tigers and lions isn't hanging out with the pack of hyenas and impalas.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. I've never really used this example, but it's like they're coexisting,
Yeah,
but they're not always enmeshed.
yeah.
And I think the thing with humans is, because we've been raised so differently, we really are different species in that way, in a strange way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's just strange. And so, blood family is interesting, but if your blood family is harming you, if they're not acknowledging the work you've done, or that you're on this path and they're still ridiculing you and shaming you,
Mm-hmm.
best to leave that.
Yeah.
But the trouble is, most people don't, because there's still this weird trauma bond,
Yeah.
to use that term. And I've seen many friends in the last year be thrown into kind of maybe what happened to you a few years ago, with family, with close friends, where they've been shamed and bullied due to their decisions. And it's devastated them.
Yeah.
Right. And then it's like, okay, well, they're not good for you. But because of our social need, when we don't have another group to go to, it's a bit of a conundrum.
Yeah.
But what I will say is, when we have more sovereignty and connection to our own biology, while we want to find new human connection, we can be pretty good on our own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we find ways to socially engage, but maybe not with people that we're bringing home, like, I live here with my husband. We don't have any children. He has a stepson, but he's gone now. We have no pets. I have no brothers and sisters. It's pretty just chill. It's just him and I take joy in going to the coffee shop and just saying hello to the person that I'm buying my coffee from.
Yeah.
That's a social connection, right? That's a way to spark up that ventral vagal. That's one thing I didn't mention when I was breaking down the parasympathetic. The other part was the social engagement. That calms us, right? That brings our nervous system down. So I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but if someone understands, oh, social engagement is important for my heart to calm down, this is like a true neurophysiological thing, I better get out of my home today and, like, go buy a jar of peanut butter.
Yeah.
even though, like, because I need to feel other humans, even though I'm not having a conversation with them, even just the nodding, the smiling, the exchange of money, the tapping, whatever, there's still that little bit of a spark, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. The, it's that, it's like sort of feeding that system in some way, shape, or form, right? However it might show up, and the importance of that, and not the necessarily like the pure isolation, or, with the past we just had, like sometimes it's not only was it the masks, but then like nobody wants to talk to you when you go to the
Yeah.
store, and everything's just cold and everything. And it just kind of,
Yeah.
it was an interesting, but another experience we can look at and say, that's how that felt.
Yeah.
How did that feel, and where can we,
Yeah.
then we get into a philosophical conversation of,
Totally.
should we have used all these measures? And we won't go there. But one last thing I wanted to mention, you were talking earlier about, having the feeling of butterflies a little bit. And this is kind of a personal anecdote, but it also relates to something that you wrote with regards to when you're describing the 21-day program. There was one line here that stuck out to me that has been playing with me. When I've done this, since I've done this work since the beginning, I've kind of had this vision of me freeing myself from this childhood trauma of speaking in front of people, and the difficulty that I've had in speaking in front of, large groups. And, I can be on the podcast, I can do my videos, and people think I'm this, super outgoing person. And then when I have to speak in a group, I'm just like, no, I'll be a mute. It's okay. That's just kind of what happens. And I know a lot of this just stems back to school, and how that, and I never just felt good and all those. Anyway, so I still accept engagements to speak sometimes publicly. And I get the butterflies. Now, so I want to kind of do two things. Thing number one is I'm going to read off kind of how this work you mentioned can help move past mental roadblocks, fears, and resistance that might paralyze you from doing what deep down you're meant to do. So for me, speaking publicly, I know, I'm not saying I'm going to be the speaker of all speakers. I'm saying I know it's something that I need to be able to do, and that I have power in doing. However, I have too many butterflies. Now, at the same time, during the call, you said sometimes when you have the butterflies, when you have these feelings, hey, maybe this isn't a path for me to go down. And what I think you meant, and I would love for you to sort of explain this, is there's something in my system that feels really not good about this. And I need to sort of sit with that and figure it out. And part two to that is, if I do go down that path and I throw myself through all that stress, and I don't have the necessary know how to deal with it, but I do the speech anyway, and everything's okay afterwards, but I still put myself through all of that. I wonder if you can sort of touch on that type of situation.
That's a good one, because you're right. And this is where contextually it's important to make some distinctions. There's the butterflies in the stomach, or the sense of something's not right, I shouldn't go down that dark alley. The fancy term would be neuroception. That came from Stephen Porges, who really highlighted the vagus nerve and its importance in mammalian physiology. And we need to be able to discern that level of, this is not good, this is dangerous, versus, I really want to do this public speaking thing,
but I'm scared shitless.
but I'm scared shitless. And something in my body is telling me I'm going to die because of past experience. And so that's where, and this is a bit more advanced, but we get into something called coupling dynamics, which is a term that is not just from Peter Levine, but kind of from the whole psychology world. I probably should look it up more, but I know how to work with it. But basically, it's like to be able to prove and rewire and say to the system, this is okay, but you feel like it isn't okay. This isn't okay, and that's accurate. It takes practice.
Yeah.
And so, when you were describing the public speaking thing, you did something with your hands, and I can't replicate it, but you're like, it's good. I want to do it. Like it was. So, I would say, how can you feel that desire and that place of creativity, let's call it creativity, engagement, servicing the world with your gifts. So to kind of, I'm seeing a sponge, like a dry, like soaking up that sponge with that essence, and take that felt sense and then imagine that in the speaking gig, for example. But to do that requires being able to really listen to the physiology and the sensations.
Yeah.
When we haven't done that level of work that takes time, that's where we clump, this is all bad. And so we have to bring in nuance and distinction. And then the other thing too is, because I remember this happened to me once. I almost passed out when I spoke to, I think it was like 500 people back in like 2005. And I literally went completely blank. I had never experienced that before. And the room just kind of was like moving. And I had my presentation and I just froze.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is this? And I had to really, without even knowing that I was doing it, ground myself, feel my hands, and focus on people. And then I came out of it. That was scary. I was like, whoa, this is a physiological response that I've never felt before in my life.
Yeah.
But we also don't want to push, because what can happen, and this kind of falls into sort of, we could say, career and business, but it's also daily life. We feel those butterflies, we feel that anxiety, and we just white knuckle it, if people know that term, right? I'm just gonna drive through, and I don't care if I'm feeling these butterflies. I'm gonna ignore them. They're a nuisance, and that's not good, because what's happening there is you're basically slam dunking yourself into a situation that you think you don't want, and maybe you don't, but you don't know. And it creates more of a survival response. And this, Joe, is why a lot of people will come out of those presentations or a weekend retreat or something, or their day, and they're just like, I'm
exhausted.
dead to the world. They've literally exhausted their adrenals and their cortisol, and they have been running it from a state of absolute sympathetic, adrenalized, but also shutdown. And when you have shutdown happening, or freeze and sympathetic, it's like the gas and the brake on the car at the same time. You burn it out. Right. And so working with something like the butterfly thing that you mentioned, it can be a fun process, right? Yeah. And it's kind of like, okay, there's some, I feel those. And this is where imagination and visualization can be useful, because we have that capacity as humans. What would it be like to be in front of 5 people? 10 people, 20 people, 50 people. Oh, no, 50 people. That's where I start to feel it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And then you go back. Okay, imagine there's 5 people there. And it's like, and you engage. And that's the other thing. A lot of times when people go into these public speaking situations, like I did back in my 20s, they're not nervous system aware. They're not engaging. If you hear anyone talk about, how they public speak. Actually, Jordan Peterson talks about that. He's like, I'm never talking to the audience. One, he's like, I normally can't see the audience because the lights are so bright, but I will talk to one person.
Yeah.
And that's how I gauge where I'm at. And then he says, and of course, I'm not going to stare at them the whole lecture, because then they're going to get uncomfortable. And then I go to the next person. And that engaging socially, as opposed to just deer in the headlights looking at all these people, allows, remember I was talking about the social engagement thing, it transfers to the heart and it brings our system back down. Yeah. So that would be my advice to you. The next time you do something, really connect with the people and see them in their humanity, and that can actually soften the system a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you said you went blank, that's always my biggest fear with public speaking, is I'm going to stand up there, go completely blank, and I'm not going to know what to say. And when I was invited to do the TEDx talk at Columbia University, I was terrified that that's what would happen back in the day. And at that point in my journey, I had been doing a lot of inner work, but not from a nervous system perspective, more like, moving through different programs or egoic work and shadow work and all that kind of stuff, a little bit more on the spiritual side. And I had kind of been able to look at and see, okay, this is a story I'm playing and this is what's happening, but not necessarily having the, I would do things like EFT tapping, and I never really found that to be overly helpful. But here I was, and if you actually look at the video of the talk, I'm about to start, and I'm like, and I look down real quick because I had a little square of notes. I had gone blank for about a half a second, and I looked down at my notes, but there was some like awareness in me that like, no, you'll be okay. And everything just came back.
Yeah.
And then funny enough, I was sort of doing the thing where I would speak to one lady and then a guy over here in a corner, and the guy over here came up after me, after the talk. And he came to me, he's like, you looked at me several times. I don't know if you were talking right at me, but I kind of got paranoid. I was like, oh yeah, no, I was just trying to like gauge your reaction.
Yeah. It's true. You got to be careful with that. But no, what you said there is so great, because when you just had a natural response that brought you out of it. Cause I think your survival mechanism probably was like, dude, if you don't snap out of this, there's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And that's probably what I did as well. But we also know people that can't bring that back will pass out.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's why people pass out when they see blood, for example. It's too much and it is out.
Yeah.
But a lot of these responses this is again the cool thing with the human system. We have control. We can figure out how to work with them, but not in a way, that's not the right word, not a controlling way, but a resilient way, so that we're not going into more survival stress.
Yeah.
And that's the part that I think is really interesting. And the more people do this work, they realize that they can really navigate intense stuff. And as their capacity grows, so does their capacity to take on more stuff, whether it's stuff that's stressful, stuff that's good. And again, it allows us to, if we go back to, just current day, be aware of what's going on, not be ignorant to what's going on, because we don't want to be ignorant to what's going on, but then come back to ourselves.
Yeah. And
that, I think, is the ticket to figuring out what we humans are supposed to do here.
Yeah.
I know that we have not even tapped into the level of intelligence that we have.
Oh yeah. It's massive. Yeah.
I mean, it's really hard to convey that, but when the bulk of human society is living in some form of survival stress, aka trapped trauma, like we're just hanging on.
Yeah.
But if just even 10%, and I don't mean 10% of the population, that too, but like if each person could have a little bit more, like 10% more regulation, it's like the 100 monkey effect. It's like it'll just topple in a good way. It's like this tipping point, and then that's where the collective will feel it.
Oh yeah, this is where we get into.
I know the collective will feel it.
Yeah, and this is where we get into some of those more non-physical, non-material abilities or senses that we know we have. That when we're talking about intuition and properly being able to navigate, it's sort of like what you were saying before. Are those butterflies a legitimate fear, or is it something else? It's, same with intuition. This stuff is heightened as we deep dive this regulation. I often wonder, not to go too off into the fringe but some of these like, I've played with remote viewing in the past, and when I was in a beautiful state in my body for 8 years, which is essentially what I had experienced when I first started to do more spiritual work, is I honestly felt like unbelievable, which is why it was so shocking when I went through that 3-year period of feeling bad. But this regulation stuff is taking me to another level beyond that, right? But these ideas of remote viewing or being able to have these senses, it comes from being in a space that is just, it's not you're off in the clouds. It's not you're not grounded. It's you're in your body. You are here. You're there. You're socially engaged. You're in this beautiful space that allows you to have access to this potential that you just never thought was possible. And it's so exciting to think about some of that stuff. Again, not from the chasing the excitement, but from the standpoint of like, We have so much more capacity than we realize.
Oh my God. It's mind blowing if you really think about it. And the one other thing, other than in addition to empowered, a lot of my students will say, is that when they get their body back and their biology back, and they're really in their like cellular
Mm-hmm.
cells and in the environment, that's another big difference between the work that I offer and a lot of other, even nervous system work that's out there. We're constantly bringing you, the student, into the environment and into your
Mm-hmm.
experience, because you cannot be who you are without the environment. The oxygen was gone, we'd all die like that.
Yeah.
Right. So we forget that we're in this atmosphere, in this environment that feeds us and we feed it. But what happens, I've heard and I've experienced this personally, is we become way more spiritual, but not from a religious necessarily point of view. We just become more connected to the universe.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I'm a Star Wars girl from the 80s. So,
The
like
force.
to me, they were saying something about the force
Yeah.
unifying us, right?
Oh yeah.
And there's a reason why towards the final movies, Luke was transporting himself into different places.
Yeah.
You saw those ones. It's like, what? How is he there? Oh, he's not there. He's actually over there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there was so much research that was done earlier on in, I don't remember exactly when, around distant prayer and intention.
Yeah.
Lynn McTaggart's where it really gets into this, and it's there, it's real. But a lot of people get fractured when they try to do it if they're not grounded in their biology.
Yeah.
A lot of psychic folk are very dysregulated, so
Yeah.
they're living in the ether, but they're not in their system.
Yeah.
And they get quite unwell. The few psychics that I know and I'm good friends with who have gone through the programs are like, holy cow, as soon as I got my body back online and my traumas were healed, just
Yeah.
like the psychic channel was open, but not in a dysregulated way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, that's another topic.
Oh, for sure. And one of the interesting things is too, like what I noticed quite a bit is the dissociation that can happen, where we want to live in these spiritual worlds almost entirely because we're uncomfortable with the way the world and the planet and ourselves feel right now, which is a whole other, sort of thing to unpack. But, I started a lot of your work with the 21-day tune-up. I mean, I did watch some of the free videos at the beginning, but why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who's interested in diving in deeper, why this is such a great place to start?
Yeah, so the 21-day nervous system tune-up, this is an online course. It's self-study. So when you join, when you begin, you're given access to the site. So everything lives on a password protected site. 21 days of lessons, exercises, video trainings, prompts. In total, there are 9 practical lessons, which might not seem like a lot, but it actually is over 21 days. You can attest to that.
Yeah.
Because these are not things that you just do once and then you're done. Yeah. You're constantly coming back to them and reintegrating and reviewing them and doing them again. And then within that 21 days, there's 5, we call them biology of stress videos. They're sort of the deep theory of the nervous system physiology. Well, you've done them, and I remember you saying that the content in that was nothing like you had ever seen before. And I think it's because it's really teaching you, the student, the things that I have learned in my training. So yes. I'm basically conveying not just the essential, but the deep, non-dumbed down education of our physiology, nervous system, the vagus nerve, how we were wired from the beginning, what memories are, all of it. And then, within the course, there's some post homework, there's some little bonuses and that kind of thing. And you're just guided through the prompts. You get emails, but you can also stop the emails if you don't want. You can restart the emails. And then within that site, we have support. So when you do that, or my other courses, you're not just left alone. Of course, you have to ask for help. So within the forum, within each page, within each lesson of the 21 days, you can ask questions from my staff. They're all trained in somatic experiencing. and other somatic methodologies. So you're really taken care of. And when you do it, you have it for life.
Yeah.
Granted, the internet in your computer still exists, right? So you can download everything. Anything audio or video is transcribed. So for those that like to read and titrate, which is to go slower, you can do that. That's a question people often ask is, do I have to finish it in 21 days? And the answer is absolutely not. You can do one lesson a week.
Yeah.
And take 21 weeks to go through it.
Yeah.
And that is something I recommend to people whom, are really unwell, who they know their capacity is low, or you do it every second day. And again, if you're not sure, you ask questions. That's the key.
Yeah. Yeah. I know I did it in a little longer than 21 days. And there were certain parts that I actually sensed like, I'm going to spend a little more time on this because of the way it felt or what I was getting out of it. It felt like I wanted to sit with it a little longer. And for me, what I enjoyed was there was not, no lesson felt like, oh my God, I got to like sit here forever to like take in the education. It's like 20, 25 minutes. Some of them I think were even a little shorter. So it's like a nice bite-sized piece that is there. And the education piece is, I think it's just so important to have, I know why I'm doing this exercise. And because I have the education, I know, oh, okay, I felt that. Okay. I know how to interpret that. Okay. Now I felt this. Now I know how to interpret that. I'm noticing this improvement. I know how to interpret that, right? So one of the things you feel is you're never wondering, is this working?
Is this wrong?
Am I doing something right? Yeah. You're kind of playing with it. Last question, if we're okay on time. This is just a quickie, but it's just, it is true, when starting some of this work that sometimes it can feel like you're almost kind of like tossed into a little bit more like, okay, why am I feeling a little bit more tensed up, or why am I feeling a little bit more dysregulated when I start doing this? Can you explain why that can happen?
Yeah, well, we've been masters, us humans, of, the metaphors are pushing things under the rug, storing, shutting our skeletons in the closet, hiding things. And so it's important to understand that most of us have done that, and that's okay. And it takes time to bring these old sensations, emotions, survival responses up and out. And they do come up and out when we grow the capacity to feel them. And so the difference between this work and, say, a body of work that's just trying to get you calm and feeling perfect is we're actually wanting to feel the really tough stuff that we stored under the rug or pushed into the closet, because it's that stuff that's creating toxicity. Yeah. It's taking up space in the system, but when it comes out, we're going to feel that fear. We might even smell the smells that were disgusting in the situation that we were in when it wasn't safe and all those sorts of things. And that's not to be alarmed when that happens. It's actually good. When someone says, oh my God, I woke up in the middle of the night, panicked. I'm like, great. That shows that you're getting out of the freeze. Yeah. Yeah. Because when we've been living in a lot of shutdown, we're just cool as a cucumber. Right. And a lot of people are in that state right now. But what they don't realize is they're actually in survival mode physiology. And so when you start to take that break off, you might feel a little terror. You might feel a little horror. You might feel a little anxiety. The key is to not stop. And that's what I'm being better at saying, because a lot of times it's freaky. It's like, I just didn't sleep for 5 nights. Well, and I say, I know. I didn't sleep for 6 months at one point when I was starting this work, and it sucked, right? And now I have no trouble. But it's showing you how much damn stuff you've stored. And then that's where you ask questions. Should I keep going? Should I just get in the bath and like float? Should I go for a walk? Do I need to call and maybe talk to a counselor? Right. So that's the other thing is, I don't say that my work means that you shouldn't see an osteopath or do some massage or have a counseling session, not at all, or go to your church group. Right. Yeah. It's like, you still need those supports, but this will help the system unlock that old stuff. And it's very different than what a lot of people portray in nervous system healing work, where it's just like, just calm your nervous system and tone the vagus nerve. It's like,
Yeah.
there's no such thing as just toning the vagus nerve,
Yeah.
right? So I say that with love, but it's like you really need to understand the distinctions. And that's why the education is so important, as you said, because a person might think that they're going crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, you're not, you're just feeling the stuff that would have made you crazy when you were 5, but you didn't have the capacity to feel it. So you shut it down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said. And I mean, for those that are interested, there'll be a link in the description for, diving a little bit deeper and taking the 21-day nervous system tune-up. As always, thank you for, your work and everything you've done, how you've helped me, and for how you're helping the world. And, I hope that others dive in and play around with that as well.
Yeah, I hope so too. You are so welcome. And thank you, Joe, for getting this out there.
Yeah.
To more people.
That's all. Take care.
Ciao.